Hello, everyone. So we should start. My name is Ronaldo Lemos, and I'll be the moderator for this panel. This panel is called Global Platforms, National Citizens, and International Development. So I expect that we talk, among other things, about the role that global internet companies have regarding very difficult issues like free speech, the right to be forgotten, the liability of the intermediaries, and so on. So I'm very happy to have with us today Ambassador Karen Kornbluh. Did I pronounce it correctly? Okay. She is a senior fellow for digital policy with the Council on Foreign Relations. So I'm also happy to have with us Peter Micek, who's the General Counsel of Access Now. And full disclosure, I serve on the board of Access Now, but I will not make your life easier because of that, Peter. But thank you for joining us. And very happy also to have Jeff Brueggeman. Did I get that right?
Excellent, yes.
Okay, thank you. And he is the VP Global Public Policy for AT&T. Thank you, Jeff, for joining this panel. I'm actually going to start with you. So the way we organized it, we are going to have short presentations by our panelists, and then we will have like a conversation, and I will open for the audience to participate in this conversation as well. So Jeff, please.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here today, and I'm going to react a little bit to some of the interesting discussion we heard this morning. And I thought it was, one way it was framed was fragmentation versus uniformity. And I think the reality is, really we're somewhere in between those two extremes. The good news from a platform perspective is broadband continues to be expanded around the world. The capacity of broadband networks and infrastructure, which is what AT&T obviously focuses on, continues to improve. Costs are coming down in many areas. And so the capabilities increasingly are there in developing countries to take advantage and harness that for education, healthcare, innovation in the economy. And so when I think of fragmentation, I think of, are there, not to say there aren't going to be local laws and cultural norms, but are there barriers beyond that that are driven by factors that we would be concerned about, whether it's human rights or economic barriers to entry, things like that. And I do think in those areas, there are some reasons to be concerned that, a couple of trends are worrying in this area. One would be, which we heard a little bit about this morning, is I think the concern that these services and the technology is being viewed as a threat, and that globalization, which we even talk about here in the United States, being viewed as a disruptor in a negative way. And I think one of the things we need to continue to do is to try to show that technology is a win-win. It's not a centralized version of the internet from the US being imposed on other countries. It's really enabling local innovation and technology sectors in all of these different countries. And I think one of the things we're trying to do is to support efforts to gather these good examples of what's happening, to show that maybe the old mindset that the only winners out of this global technology trends were US companies is really not the case anymore. So we have to kind of win the economic arguments, I think. But then on the human rights side, I think those, if anything, maybe can be even more challenging. As Eric Schmidt said, when we go into a country, we get licensed, we of course have to comply with the law. So that's not the issue. The issue is, can we create more interoperable frameworks around the world so that we are respecting human rights and we are, generally presuming to have cross-border data and the free flow of information, recognizing that, of course, there will be local laws and cultural norms, respected as part of that. Or are we going to face sometimes, overly rigid backlash that really, sometimes through security or privacy, that did resonate with me this morning, people mentioning that, some actions can be taken in the name of security or privacy that really have either economic motivations or human rights impacts. And so I think the way we have to approach that is from a policy perspective and a capacity building perspective. I think we have to continue to develop the right models for ways to deal with things like government access and respect for human rights. We are trying to be more engaged on those issues at a global level, and I'm sure Peter will talk about what Access Now and other NGOs are doing in that area. But we need to set the model and then work to try and advance that, with countries around the world and get increasing consensus for implementing that. But there's also, I think, a capacity building element here. A lot of bad things happen when policymakers don't understand the technology, and we're going to talk about some specific examples, but we see things like data localization and network shutdowns as reflexive, old-style thinking imposed on the new technology, and a lot of times there are ways to address what may be a very valid concern in a more targeted or less impactful way, but we see, I think, a real challenge with regulators and government officials not understanding the technology. So I think that's a little bit of something that we can do in the private sector to try and find more ways to build capacity. And that can even be with, say, law enforcement or judges. If they don't understand the technology, you can get some really bad results that may be unintended. So there are a lot of issues out there, but I do think there are some things that we can all do to help continue to try and raise the level of respect for the free flow of information and for the rights of citizens to access that information while still not imposing a uniform one-size-fits-all view of what's going to be the way that citizens in an individual country will enjoy the benefits of the internet.
Thank you, Jeff. So Ambassador Karen, would you like to go next?
If I have to, sure. I just want to preface this by saying that I'm a huge techno-optimist, as I call it. I've been involved with internet policy for a long time, starting with the Telecommunications Act of '96 that I worked on when I was on the Hill, and then I was at the Federal Communications Commission and Treasury under President Clinton in the early days of the internet. And then wrote about broadband as a productivity driver for the New America Foundation, and then I was the ambassador to the OECD, and we championed the OECD internet policymaking principles that talk about free flow of information and how to protect that. So let me say that as a preface. Huge fan of the internet, have been really involved in it, but I do think that we have to take the backlash against globalization that we've seen most recently exhibiting itself in elections as a sign that we need to go back and rethink some of our frameworks and approaches. And I remember when this idea of thinking of breaking down balkanization, as it used to be called, of the internet, that we would use trade policy. That was sort of a new idea. And I remember Google produced like a 20-page paper arguing that, and people were like, that's interesting. I guess free flow of information could be seen as a trade issue. And now we've all adopted it. But I think that's part of the place where our framework has to be reexamined. We can't overburden this idea of trade. You can't do everything through trade. If people are feeling that it's not secure, or intellectual property isn't being protected, or they don't have capacity to participate in some of these multilateral organizations, law enforcement issues, when law enforcement in one country can't get access to information they need because it's on a server in the US, and then all the social issues, all the social protection issues when people are feeling that their jobs are being eliminated, that can't all be handled on a trade agreement. And so that's not to say that we shouldn't persist with a lot of these ideas that were on the TPP, but I don't think we should put all our eggs in that basket. And I think we need to look at other institutions, other kinds of agreements. And we are, there are conversations going on now in the G20 around digital issues, but I think the US probably should take more of a role in making sure that the G20 is endorsing free flow and then maybe working through some of these other issues with that as a pursuit. I know that some countries that would prefer to have more national control and don't support some of the values that we support are using the G20. I think MLAT reform is one that is really, really, really boring, but that's about the U.S. Updating its system for granting foreign law enforcement access. Everybody's recommending we do it, we just haven't gotten around to doing it. And it's complicated, I should say. It's very complicated in terms of making sure people's rights are respected through that process, that you're not handing over information that would violate their rights. But I think a lot of people have put forward some very solid proposals about how we can at least digitize the process and make it go a little faster. Interoperability of privacy regimes is something that the FTC, I know, is working on, and then capacity building in different countries. And then lastly, I just want to say something about the U.S. government's role. I think companies, somebody asked Eric Schmidt about Google's foreign policy, and companies can do a lot, but they're restricted to some degree if they want to pursue their economic ends, and they may comply with the letter of the law in some countries. But I think it's the U.S. government's role to promote not what are U.S. values per se, but what we think of as universal values. And coincidentally, it happens to be good for our companies, which are some of the biggest companies on the internet and want to have free entry. So I think there's a nice coincidence there of free expression, human rights, and so on. We think of those as universal values. We can promote them, and they also happen to be very good for innovation, for our companies to have markets overseas, and so on. And so I think that there's a role for the government to play there in the foreign policy of the internet that goes beyond what companies can do on their own.
Very good. Thank you. Peter.
Thanks, Ronaldo. Yeah, I'm happy to be here with Access Now. We've, despite our name, not generally focused on access issues. Traditionally, we've looked at the quality of service maybe than the quantity of subscribers, for instance. But it's become increasingly clear that the unconnected are a major stakeholder group without a voice, often the most marginalized and vulnerable users, or non-user group, I should say, as well as users. And we shouldn't proceed with any internet policy discussion without considering that more than half the world remains off of the internet. And unfortunately, in a lot of ways, I think the acceleration, the ubiquitous drive towards mobile coverage has slowed when you reach this last last mile, last kilometer, rural communities, and the research is starting to show that it's not just geography and it's not economics and it's not happenstance, that huge swaths of populations remain offline. There's a good study in Science showing that actually those who remain unconnected overlap quite well with those lacking political power, lacking agency, lacking respect, for their human rights, often by their national governments. So, I think there's a really, really great, ambitious goal, Sustainable Development Goal 9C, which says that the 1.5 billion unconnected and least developed countries will be online by 2020. That is very, very ambitious. 2020, right? It's up for review at the UN in July at the high-level political forum on the SDGs. Really eager to take part in that. But I think it's going to take all of our stakeholder groups and more to build the coalition to advance connectivity. But then coming from a digital rights organization, I have to ask connected. What does that mean? Connected to what? What does that connectivity look like? Is it app-based? Is it purely mobile? Is it gatekeep through a specific platform, a private platform? Run on servers and under laws developed thousands of miles away with little local input. And so we when the SDGs really broke out. We congratulated this ambitious set of goals, but also came together with civil society and around 30 groups from across the world came together around a statement of what we want that connected world to look like and what that connectivity means. We've seen the human rights impacts, the adverse impacts on human rights and economies that the tech sector has and continues to have. We've seen, like other panelists have said, what poorly thought out government policy, dictated by people who don't understand the internet, what harm that can do. And so, we developed a set of principles, the human rights principles for connectivity and development, that should be in one of the handouts, one of the printouts that's circulating here, and are looking for places to apply them. And just really quickly, the principles are in substance, of course. It's respect for privacy, freedom of expression. It's ways to prevent internet shutdowns, massive privacy violations, massive security leaks and breaches. But it's also process. So process is, I think, the key point. And that's why, even though personally I was on the streets in 1999 saying, no free trade without protections for workers, for the environment, and we need to build these protections into trade agreements, right? But, I work for an organization now who says, no, we don't want to build in these data protection, mandates into trade agreements because of what? Not because there's anything wrong with data protection. We have a huge Brussels office that's more than happy to expound on how important that is, and that is a model that's followed by most of the world, unlike the U.S. patchwork. No, the problem is with the process of negotiating those trade agreements. It's opaque. It's multilateral. It's not the multi-stakeholder and open and inclusive method that's produced the internet that we know and love. And so, we are very wary of using trade as a way to, force or arbitrate rights. And then one last piece. I think I totally agree that jurisdiction is complicated. We have a new 5-part blog series on jurisdiction online, if anyone's interested, that really has awesome exploration beyond from MLATs and beyond. But yeah, to bring it back a little bit more to broad principles, I think we have to see that we want to instill respect for the internet, but we don't want to use fear as the tactic to do that. So how do you get governments to respect their digital economy, their entrepreneurs, who might be facing up the big telcos and the incumbents in the country, who probably are upset about policies that enhance network discrimination, they're built on monopolies and legacies of incumbency. But so how do you instill respect for this burgeoning internet culture and economy without that overarching fear of this new technology and the disruption? And so yeah, that's something that I hope to work on.
Thank you, Peter. Any immediate comments on the part of Jeff, Ambassador? Okay, so let me start with a few questions. A couple of weeks ago, I was reading the New York Times, and I saw this very interesting full-page ad for this company called Private Internet Access. I'm not sure how many of you heard of Private Internet Access. Okay, there's one person. Two, so they're a VPN company, and they were basically advertising in the New York Times against a change in position by the FCC to roll back on the rules of privacy, as far as I understand, in the prohibition that basically infrastructure companies and ISPs could actually collect data at the infrastructure layer. So basically they were posting themselves against this, and at the same time advertising the fact that, okay, so if you don't want to have your data collected, you probably should hire a VPN service. So my question is, what is your perspective in terms of these new debates about privacy? And especially because if the United States take this position, this is going to be very influential over other countries as well. And I can speak for Brazil, which is the country that I live, which 3 years ago passed a law that basically prohibited any data collection at the infrastructure layer. So I would be curious to listen from you about this particular issue and whether there is a regulation asymmetry as well between providers, like online service providers, OTTs, and also infrastructure providers. So it would be great to hear from you about that. Jeff, maybe.
Yeah, I'll lead off, and maybe to give a little context here, you know, for 20 years, internet privacy in the U.S. was regulated by the Federal Trade Commission, and, you know, as Peter said, we don't have a comprehensive privacy legislation in the U.S., and you can argue about whether it's strong enough, but it was, that was the regime that applied to everyone. And then, as part of the net neutrality proceeding, the FCC reclassified broadband as a common carrier service, which had the legal effect of moving privacy jurisdiction over to the Federal Communications Commission for broadband. They had had it for voice services, but not there. So you know, really what happened with this congressional action, the FCC had adopted rules that were going to take effect later this year, and Congress is using this obscure authority that I had not heard about until last fall, you know, basically voided the rules and prevented them from taking effect. And I think, you know, really the question now from our perspective is, you know, are we going to restore a unified privacy regime for the internet under the FTC as the way forward here, or not? And then I think that will raise questions, as you said, about the asymmetry. You know, I think the trend globally on privacy, and we see this with the GDPR in Europe, is there should be consistent privacy regulations for the data. The sector specific can cause a lot of confusion online because a consumer doesn't understand that, you know, if my ISP collects data, it's the FCC, but if the website or the device collects the data, it's the FTC. So, you know, we support kind of unifying it, whatever privacy regime we're going to have, that it should be consistent online. And I think that is where the global trend is. The other interesting point about that ad that you mentioned is, you know, whether privacy and security are going to start to become market differentiators.
Yeah.
And I think you see that with Apple, and I think you see, you know,
WhatsApp.
maybe definitely more on the, certainly on the security side. I think consumers are very concerned, but increasingly with privacy as well. So I think another question will be, you know, even if there's the legal authority to do it, I think we are all going to be very sensitive to what our customers are going to think about any program that we implement, recognizing that, you know, privacy really is a sensitivity too. So I think you have to overlay that perspective on top of this debate as well.
Yeah, I think the other thing is just what's happening in Europe is so important, and I think we have to see how that develops, because I'm sure people here know, but they're doing both the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and the e-privacy regulation, and depending on how those are implemented, they're going to have an enormous effect. And when you talk about, you know, will the U.S. have spillover effect to the rest of the world, I think it may be more likely that the European rules will, and we'll see how that, how those develop. So I think that'll be really, really interesting. And we can't forget that U.S. companies, all companies, you know, have obligations to follow what's called the FIPS, you know, the Fair Information. I can remember what the 2 Ps stand for. Privacy protection. Practices, principles. I've seen it all different ways. But, you know, so ideas like, and the OECD actually re-looked at their privacy guidelines to say, you know, are the FIPS still relevant? And they decided, this was a few years ago, that yes, they are. But you have to reinterpret them all the time in terms of what the challenges are. And so even if you're operating in a country that doesn't have strong privacy protections, again, back to this idea that companies have this tension, you know, they are, especially if they're U.S. companies, have this tension where you can't just do what's, you know, the local law. You have certain, you know, obligations as an American company, but also you want to respect some international standards. And so you have to think, you know, how can I minimize my data? How can I be transparent about what I do? How long should I keep it? And so on, in keeping with those principles.
Yeah, thanks. I'm definitely in favor of the data protection principles, but you know, there needs to be a real redress mechanism there. You know, the patchwork and the kind of backwards-looking approach of you know, slapping wrists after you've found them in the cookie jar is it's not really something you can base your economy on. I don't think it provides the certainty that we always hear the business community saying they want. And so, we are certainly in favor of comprehensive protections, educating consumers proactively on what rights they have and how to exercise them. And yeah, I do have to push back against this divide, this equivalency between the ISPs and the edge providers in terms of privacy. There's, first of all, from a consumer choice perspective, you really don't have a meaningful choice in most parts of the U.S. And in much of the world for who provides your broadband. There's better competition in many European countries, but with here, you really do have to vote with your feet. Often you have to move if you want to switch ISPs, and so there isn't this ability to, even if the privacy policies were really clear and above board, there isn't this competition or choice between them. So that's the place where the government should step in and protect a baseline of privacy. You do have choices of what content and email and other providers to use. And we certainly are a big proponent of standardization of privacy policies and things for those providers through things like the Ranking Digital Rights Index. But I think I'd love to go back to the rest of the world a little bit, since this is meant to be about development. I think securitization is a real thing. Governments should update their laws, for the digital age. However, they should not copy and paste, provisions that criminalize most ordinary uses of the internet, or simply, add on penalties because you used a computer to commit, the trespass instead of, breaking and entering. So. I think there's a lot of work to be done with governments. There is a role for the ITU, but the ITU should not run the internet. There is a role for national governments, but those national governments should not get to decide, international rules. That goes for the U.S. as well as France. I think that's why we do need to go back to process.
Okay, so let me follow up on this a little bit. So, what are the global fora that can actually tackle these issues? Because I think the point of the trade agreements, they have been playing this role to a certain extent. So you have like the IGF, who, as far as I've been following it, has been incapable of actually creating any sort of binding proposition or any proposition at all. And you have the ITU, which has an important but somehow limited capacity to deal with these issues. So what are the fora that we have to actually deal with these issues? Are the internet companies the decision-making entities of the last resort that we have? Because in the end, they are the ones that actually enforce their own rules. Or do we have any other institutions like the national judiciary branches like France that are basically seeking to expand the application of the right to be forgotten globally? Are they going in the right direction or the wrong direction? So what are the fora that we have?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think both Peter and Karen mentioned, I think it's some that are important, and we heard about some this morning. So I think trade agreements, for example, are very important for things like data localization when they're just market barriers to entry, and when you're talking about the physical deployment of the infrastructure and is it even available. So that's the example where I think trade can be helpful. I agree on things like human rights and privacy and security. Looking for other ways to tailor those types of agreements can be helpful. We've seen some good progress with the Europeans on kind of unifying privacy and then negotiating with the US on how that works. I think the APEC privacy framework is starting to build what could be a very helpful interoperable framework, and we see countries like Japan saying if you participate in the APEC framework, then we're going to let you transfer data out of the country, and that is very helpful for those privacy type of issues. And then, Bill Drake mentioned this morning, I do think that the technical work that's done at ICANN and IETF in a multi-stakeholder forum is extremely important for keeping the the operation at the very technical layer of the internet in a, largely free from government interference, and really letting the technologists kind of run that is extremely important, and trying to keep that insulated from political pressure. Then we can debate, I think, the more challenging issues about freedom of expression and human rights, and I think that's where we have to continue to work. It's probably a combination of through the UN process, where there are some established principles, and working unilaterally and multilaterally to try and strengthen those commitments. And then we even do that as U.S. companies as we go into countries to try and engage and to kind of maybe take the atmosphere that we take for granted here and try and engage with governments in other countries as well to help with those issues. But it is complicated, and I don't think there's one solution.
Yeah.
Ambassador.
Yeah, I think I like the way Jeff laid it out, and it seems that since everything happens on the internet now, we can't think of everything as an internet policy issue. So the things that really have to do with the technical layer and so on, I think these multi-stakeholder organizations and entities that have been set up have still proved, there's always a question, are some people going to start gaming them? Because, certain countries that have values that are anathema to what the internet has been, are they going to try to game the system by sending a ton of people? The multi-stakeholder process always has that potential, but so far it seems to be, everybody seems to think it's working really well and it's inclusive, and let's not break that by looking for some other organization. And then we have some other institutions that are set up to deal with some of these other issues in the offline world, and it's just a question of figuring out how they can work in the online world. Interoperability and the privacy framework seems to be a really great way to go, and that seems to be moving forward between the safe harbor and the APEC principles. I think the FTC just recognized them. One of the things, I don't know if this is a useful distinction, but one of the things that the OECD Internet Policymaking Principles tried to do was make a distinction between national policies and the free flow of information, so that you could have a national policy on intellectual protection or intellectual property or consumer protection, but it couldn't interfere with the free flow or certain universal rights like human rights. And all the countries of the OECD, which are the developed countries, signed on. And it might be Brazil. One other country signed on. It might have been Brazil. I think that was an interesting distinction, that you can set national policies for things that are of national importance where they may differ, but it can't constrain this free flow. And that is sort of like what the trade regime is like, right? That you can have, or what some people suggest. You can set your environmental policy, you can set your labor policy, but it shouldn't constrain sort of international rights. But in practice, that becomes really difficult because, what does the community of nations, what does the U.S. and some of the developed world think of certain things that other countries would think of as purely domestic? So I think the rubber hits the road at some point in that distinction.
Mm-hmm. So Peter, I was reading the other day the Edelman Trust Barometer. It's interesting because they publish this every year. They do this research about trust. And I think it's not a surprise for everyone that trust is in decline everywhere. And the only two types of organizations that people still trust in more than 50% are the business sector and NGOs. So in this context, we are discussing about fora and actors for these issues. What do you think is the role of NGOs? And I have to inform that trust in NGOs is also declining. It's still like above 50%, but trust in the business sector is also declining. It's declining everywhere, but these are the only two organizations.
It's not as fast as the other.
Yeah, that's correct. It's a matter of pace, I guess, but they're still above the 50% line. So,
thanks. Yeah, and I do think like one of the corollaries of that is corruption, which I feel like is another sort of barometer, perception indicator as much as a factual criteria, and maybe there's better work being done by journalists showing corruption among government officials, which would explain what went unsaid, which is that trust in government is dropping. But as far as business and NGOs, like let's look at NGOs. I think we have a lot of gaps. We have some of the same blinders that, speaking in the tech sector, that the companies do. Look at gender. Like the companies have not, in exporting more or less the U.S. libertarian free expression approach, have not taken seriously gendered attacks and the idea that perhaps abuse on your platforms is impacting adversely the free expression of women on your platform, or people who identify as certain genders on your platforms. So, and I do think, speaking as an NGO, that we have not seriously confronted the attacks that take place online and how people of different genders are affected differently. Other NGOs absolutely have and have been great leaders in this space. But yeah, I'll take that on and say that just like we tell businesses they should not make one set of rules and determine how to enforce those rules by a bunch of Silicon Valley tech bros or something. NGOs likewise should not just take the UN guiding principles and throw them at governments. Take the ICCPR and say, well, isn't it clear what this says? Like in our principles that we developed for human rights and connectivity and development projects, the process is consulting local communities and bringing them on board before, during, and after, and really bringing them on as full partners. So I was glad to hear Eric Schmidt say diversity and inclusion, is a fact, and I think in the NGO world, just like in the business world,
that's good. And it reminds me of the role of standard organizations as well. So, for instance, IEEE, which is a standard organization, is now creating a standard for ethics in artificial intelligence, and I find that very interesting, actually. So that's stepping into the territory of access somehow. Guys should take a look at that. But anyways, let me change the subject a little bit and talk about internet shutdowns, which I think is another concern. Brazil, which is a democratic country and passed very strong laws protecting free speech and net neutrality, has been doing some shutdowns recently. It shut down WhatsApp 3 times. Due to court decisions. The reason was the police wanted to have access to the conversations that were taking place within WhatsApp. And of course, that's hard to provide because all the communications are encrypted. And then as a way to compel the company to actually provide that data, the lower court judge basically ordered the entire service to be shut down. And it was like for 2 or 3 days until the Court of Appeals, that moved rather quickly, reversed these shutdowns. And now this case is at the Supreme Court in Brazil. But my question is, this is the reason that Brazil is doing that. But you see that happening in Thailand, you see that happening in Turkey, you see that happening in multiple countries. When that happens, does telcos stand with their users, or they do comply with these orders? How do you react to these issues?
Well, I think it's a very challenging issue for the operators, because we're even concerned about what happened in Egypt, for example, where they just turned off the communications network for everyone because it was viewed as being part of feeding the revolution. So I think we have to worry about not just content blocking, which is a form of a network shutdown, but even the more extreme case of actually a network shutdown. So we've signed on to some principles. I think we strongly support what Access Now has said is, you need to have rule of law for what the process is going to be here. The reality is, if we have people on the ground in a country and we have a legal order to do something, you're really at risk if you don't comply. So the way to fix that is to make sure that the laws do have protections in place. And I also think it goes back to the education point before, is we need to really make sure that countries understand the internet is not just a content platform anymore. It's physical safety and health and everything else. So there are major implications of implementing these orders, and oftentimes they are difficult to implement in a very targeted way as well. So they have unintended consequences. So I'm going to go back to our earlier point that there's the lack of understanding of the technology plays a part in the challenge here.
Yeah, and I guess this is where I come back to the fact that I one of the things that I liked about the whole push for internet freedom and the small part we did at the OECD is I think the U.S. can stand, the government especially, and the companies have a big role to play too, but can stand for the importance of an open internet and an internet as a place of free expression and free speech. And I think if we can get some of these other issues dealt with through MLAT reform, because some countries do have a legitimate issue when a local crime has been committed by a local person, but the data happens to be on a server in the U.S. If we could solve that problem and get that off the table, and if we can deal with some of these privacy issues and take that off the table and say, okay, this is a speech issue, and this is or a expression issue or maybe a slightly lower priority. It's a unfair treatment of a U.S. company issue. Let's not confuse that with these other issues of privacy and law enforcement and cyber. So if we could be more practical and put some real attention on it, and I think that sometimes, so I was arguing that before, that everything's on the internet, so we can't just think of everything as internet policy, we have to deal with it separately. But the downside of that is, you have law enforcement over here and our intelligence community over here and our intellectual property protectors here, and there's not a concerted single effort that says, let's take a whole of government approach a little bit as the U.S. It's in our interest in so many ways to support a single open internet with everybody on. It's in our foreign policy and our development policy and our, just our competition policy, economic policy. It's in our interest, and so how can we work together and each agency be a little less parochial to push forward these issues and be behind free expression and free speech and so on.
Any comments, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to what we were talking about this morning of, it can be okay to have he's a term like governments or something, but it's the idea of not fragmentation, but decentralized management of the internet's resources and being able to make decisions about cybercrime over here and the DNS over here is okay, I think, as long as we do have this central commitment to one internet and to some basic baseline norms like I would say one government's laws don't get to decide what everyone sees. Eric Schmidt pointed to child pornography as actually one thing that there's consensus on. Maybe there are more, maybe it's more on process principles than substance, but it's not that fun to say, but I think we do have to accept the decentralized nature and then see how these different bodies can interact.
Good. I'm going to open for the audience in a second. I just have one very quick question that I would like to hear from you, which is, so Germany is actually working to pass a law in which it will give global internet companies, it will impose them with the obligation to actually remove fake news. Basically, if they don't do that, they can be fined up to, I think, $50 million or something. So this actually concerns me because this is going to be decided by the companies, so they will take another responsibility of basically deciding what is fake news or not, among other sorts of content as well. It's like a broader legislation. And they already have been doing that in terms of the right to be forgotten. So what worries me, among other things, is that you don't create a body of court decisions when you do that. You don't create jurisprudence about these decisions. So if you want to take content down in Brazil, you have to take it to the courts, and the courts will decide whether that content should be up or not, and will provide reasons like for which it should be taken down or not. So if you impose that on the companies, it feels to me that it's at one point power, and at the second point it might be against due process, and not creating like a track record. So I'd love to hear quickly from you about that before we turn to the audience.
Uh-oh, you're looking at me?
Yes.
I don't know enough I'm fascinated by this issue. I don't think anybody can have gone through the last 6-8 months and not feel that this is an enormously important issue to confront. I saw an article in a paper that asked the question, is the internet a failed state? Which, given what I told you about how, what a techno-optimist I am, gave me a really bad feeling in my stomach. So I think this is a hugely important challenge. We do not want the internet weaponized. We don't want the internet to become one of these trust barometer failures. So it's incredibly, incredibly important, and I hope to be looking at these issues a little more closely. But I share your worry a lot about turning internet intermediaries into police. I think it raises the cost for everybody. I think it can hurt innovation. I think it can hurt speech. I think it can hurt expression. But I don't want to throw up my hands about fake news and worse. Yeah.
Right. Any comments?
People. I was at the EU talking about this on Wednesday, and the sentiment in the room was, was a bit different, I think, than we might have here. There's a lot of people upset that these are monopolies. These companies are not, anywhere near the diversity of media ownership that we tried to get through regulation often in the broadcast sector when we had radio and TV stations, and said they couldn't be owned by the same person, the same city. For example, there's just a couple platforms. Facebook is it is the internet in a lot of the world, and they've waded into a whole lot of media-like services and service provision and distribution, without being totally transparent about their content moderation policies, about their revenue sharing with the media that depend on them, that are forced to depend on them for survival. There's a whole lot of sentiment that's pretty more than happy to use fake news, especially something like fake news before an election in Germany, just something that directly impacts politicians, makes them shaking in their boots. Of course, why not go after these platforms that have seemed to welcome the profits and the users without taking on some of the ethics?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I agree with both the concerns. I think this is one of the most challenging issues because while if you look at it from a media perspective, there have always been these types of concerns. On the other hand, I was going to make the point that Karen mentioned, which is protection for intermediaries on the internet has been a core, I think, value that has allowed the internet to grow. And I do worry as an internet service provider that we could be next. We have seen in the past requests of, well, why isn't the internet service provider blocking? Well, kind of like the WhatsApp in Brazil, that the idea that somebody should stop this and I'm going to go to the party that I know can turn it off and do that, I think would be real concerning. So, I guess if we're going to take on these issues, let's try to do it at a level that is at the service where there are decisions being made. They do need to be made responsibly, whether it's accepting advertising. That seems to be a much safer area to think about regulating. But if you're getting into, I'm transmitting content or I'm hosting content that someone else put up, I do worry that governments will look to the platforms to say, you solve it, and that would be really dangerous too. So.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So let's open to the audience, see if we have questions. Please raise your hand. Don't be shy. My questions are endless, it can be the whole afternoon asking questions, but feel free. Yes, please.
Yeah, so you're saying that internet should be a public good or a human right, and that by 2020 or whenever everyone should be connected. But unfortunately, there are some areas where really this connectivity doesn't make sense. It makes sense from a business perspective. So the number of users or the cost of maintaining this network is too high. So I guess I would like to know what do you think that is the best solution for this from both a more advocacy perspective and both from a service provider perspective. If it's enforcing by law to, if you want to operate in a country, you need to work in these regions, or what's the best solution to this?
You know, I would be the most optimistic about the technology. In some countries, the percentage of wireless coverage exceeds that of electrical power coverage. So I think whether it's solar panels and low cost antennas, there are a lot of interesting solutions that are being deployed to solve it. I think Peter made a really interesting point though, but is there the political will to help serve these customers? And the network is part of it, but they also have to have devices and have to have services and applications that they're going to be able to use. And I think maybe you're seeing some political limits of the support for that at the individual country level. So I think we need to approach it from that perspective as well. But technology-wise, I guess I would be very optimistic that the costs are coming down and there are some really innovative ways to reach the unconnected, but it's solving some of the other issues.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I mean, there are old, tried but true ways to extend access to rural areas. Universal service funds or something that I think has worked fairly well in the U.S. I know India has a huge, like billions of dollars that it's sitting on that I think that's not using optimally. But these are taxes, essentially subsidies that telcos often pay. Acknowledging the fact that you can hook up 100 subscribers on a city block for cheaper than you can get one subscriber in a rural area. There are real economics there. I think decentralizing the networks is important. Opening up spectrum policies. Mozilla just awarded a really innovative project in rural India using TV white spaces. These are great, chunks of spectrum that are largely going unused. Long distances, high bandwidth. So, that's a great place for the ITU to step in and say, hey, we're out of the TV era. We can experiment a little. So, yeah, again, tech. Yeah, there's a lot of tech solutions, but. I do have to plug for net neutrality. I think these zero rating programs are being oversold. So yeah, innovative business models, sure, but there's a whole world out there, and just getting a few access to a few apps and services through Facebook or another provider who strike a deal with your local telco is still kind of it's playing by the same rules that have gotten us to this place where half the world's offline. So we're in favor of rights respecting innovation. Happy to talk more.
Good. Yes, please.
I noticed that Access Now is one of the organizations, along with Columbia University, who's taken on a great interest in the claims of, American sort of ISO security agencies to be able to access people's phones as they come into the country. And when I tell my students in my human rights and social media class that you basically at this point have no right to bring your phone back to the country without a certain amount of supervision, shall we say. So how is that campaign going, and do you see much likelihood of success there?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great softball. No, but I can't take credit, but one of our geniuses in DC came up with Fly Don't Spy. FlyDon'tSpy.org.com. Oh wow, look at us. All right. FlyDon'tSpy.com. So yeah, there's awesome organizing being done. That's the mantra. You have no rights at the border. It's not true, and it certainly shouldn't be policy. And so, yeah, we're striking coalitions. That's the Trump bump for us. Is putting the mirror up and saying who have you been working with and who haven't you been working with, and I think very, very quickly we realized that there are whole expert organizations working on immigrant, refugee rights that we need to be talking to immediately. So the ACLU obviously has done great leadership. And I'm eager to see the companies, I would ask, obviously companies, this is not in the corporate interest to have, users fearful of taking their devices, across borders. And, when and if, there's going to be real concerted corporate pushback in the U.S.
Yeah, I think it fits into, maybe it raises a couple of issues. One is this broader issue of the legal standards that should apply generally for online data and access to it. And I think we have been supportive of updating those laws, and I think this is almost an offshoot of some of that. But it also gets into a little bit of the kind of encryption type debate, whether there should be, kind of how to deal with that challenging issue.
Let me quickly follow up on that. I read a post by a Princeton researcher that she suggested that companies should create a border protection mode in their phones, for instance, in which you would press a button and then your phone would switch to a completely different mode that would allow you to go through border protection and protect your privacy on your original email and so. Do you think companies should get that far, like basically designing products to protect their customers in terms of privacy and now border protection? Because sometimes when you fly to a country in which you don't have the adequate levels of internet and cybersecurity, people take a burner phone, a cheap phone that you buy and then you discard after you go back. But that is actually pretty expensive, and it takes you a lot of time to get a phone like that prepared. So I wonder if design wouldn't be capable of actually solving that. So I'll be interested in listening from you whether companies should be concerned about these issues.
Yeah, I've had talks. That's certainly one of the ideas. Easy hide modes and things, and it sucks. This is not what we should be spending our time thinking about, how to cat and mouse our way around bad government policy. But when governments, renege their responsibilities to respect rights, they leave vacuums that other stakeholders have to try and fill. So, yeah, companies should be always looking, platforms should always look for ways where users can protect themselves against specific threats. But this, should be more of a policy. I think one of the better ideas I've heard was from a technologist who's like, no, that's not safe. It's hard enough to keep yourself safe. Just with what we have, we can't go, continually developing new tools. But it should be corporate policy. Make it a policy of large organizations, of maybe even states or corporations, that when you cross the border, you kind of wipe or you have your data stored remotely, and so that way you're not just putting the particular users at risk, because who would use that function? It's kind of like you're flagging yourself to Customs and Border Patrol as someone meriting their scrutiny. If you have business leaders saying, actually, this is a policy for employees.
Any questions? No. Okay. Yeah. Please.
Following up on that topic of encryption, we heard Schmidt say, plug in Gmail's encryption. At the G20 meeting recently, Kathy Brown of the Internet Society made a statement about basically encryption should be everywhere by default, just all through the internet. We know that governments are trying to put in backdoors. Do you think the governments will get swamped by the move to encryption?
So what was the last part? Do you think governments would?
Well, their efforts will be to nothing because the move to total encryption will just swamp them.
So encryption everywhere as a policy, right?
As a policy, end to end.
I know a certain organization who supports this, but yeah, maybe Jeff.
Well, I think we're headed there for security reasons, to encrypt as much as possible throughout, and whether it's the device or the communications links. I think the interesting policy debate in my mind is, really what we're setting up is the solution then is that the government hacks into things as the way to get access, as they did the iPhone, and somehow that doesn't seem like a great answer either. But I think I don't know what the right solution is, but it seems like a no-win where you either have a backdoor or you're challenging your governments to become expert hackers and break into the things.
Yeah, I guess I agree with that, but I think the whole conversation in the public realm has gotten so confused. So we think of encryption, or on the front page of the newspaper and on television, encryption seems like this anti-safety issue, as opposed to the whole idea of encryption is to prevent crime and keep you secure. It's not to hide bad guys. That's not the point of encryption. And so I think we have to figure out some way to tell the story a little bit better. And it is true that when it comes to anti-terrorism efforts, governments are pretty good. It's when it's basic law enforcement issues that basic law enforcement doesn't have the ability to crack encryption. I mean, I'm overgeneralizing. And so that, there again, I hate to get back to this boring MLAT issue, but like if we could solve that problem, that would get rid of one of the excuses for encryption, for backdoors and for breaking encryption. But I think we have to have in this world of cybersecurity threats, we have to have a big conversation about that, about cybersecurity threats and about encryption and fighting it, and about the importance of encryption for safety. And then I think we have to isolate the terrorism issue from the law enforcement issue.
We had a question right there. Yes. Is there one over there? But it's kind of far, right? You can ask your question from there. Okay. So if you can introduce yourselves, I have been forgotten to ask, before you ask the question.
Yeah, sure. I'm Vanessa. So here we are advocating the globalization of platforms and internet. But on the other hand, in 2016, we're seeing Brexit and also Trump presidency going to build up the wall and also going to review the immigration policy. So it seems that the world has turning towards localization or protection of local citizenship. So do you think that it's going to be, in turn, impact the globalization of internet?
I think it's a big risk. I share your concern, and I think we have to continue through both trade negotiations and as well as, I think, direct outreach to... One of the things that we found is there is oftentimes a country will have a perception that open cross-border data only helps other companies. And so, we have to go to India and say, well, actually there are a lot of call centers in India and they can't operate if they can't transfer data. So you're hurting yourself by doing this just as much as you're potentially keeping out, this thought that you're keeping out competitors. So I think there's an education effort that has to come from this, and we all have to try and, I think, be able to show that they're going to be better off with cross-border and open technology rather than trying to keep this out.
Yeah, I don't think anybody can have lived through the last bunch of months without rethinking a lot of our approaches to things. And the internet has definitely been part of the process of breaking a lot of old institutions and a lot of old culture and a lot of old economic relationships. And I don't think we broadly, the world has thought about how to respond to that enough and updated our old institutions and our old ways of doing things. So, simple example is making sure that people in the U.S. Who are being displaced by jobs from Indian call centers or wherever have job training to fill some of the tech jobs. We haven't been doing the hard work. We've I think the reason that we load up trade agreements or we load up, internet policy with other things is because we've sort of given up on working out these things either through domestic politics or internationally. And unfortunately, I think we have to roll up our sleeves and really do some hard work and think about, these people, we don't want to give in to the worst impulses, but there are some legitimate complaints there, and people are raising their hands and saying, pay attention. And so I think we have to figure out how do we pay attention in the right ways, not the wrong ways. And if that means retraining and protecting some local culture and so on, I think we have to do that while, again, protecting these international values. But I think that's going to be really, really, really hard work, and you marry that with this trust issue is huge. I mean, people in the US especially do not trust their government to do things like training, so they're not sure they want to entrust them with the money or the power to implement some of these policies. So it's even harder than you would think at first.
Let me take two quick questions here, actually three, provided you promise you'll be really quick. So yes, please.
Quite a few people believe that there's a intersection in international development between inequality and then the rise of conflict, or at least localized divides. Largely that's kind of spoken about in a financial, but also in kind of service provision, and then also in relationship to governments. How do you see kind of access to internet and the inequality of technology that's growing on a global scale? Do you see that having any impact on localized conflicts, or even kind of growing to a state level conflict?
Very good. Let me take yours.
Yeah, it's kind of relatively related to what the host is talking about. Yeah, when you talk about encryption, I mean, clearly the government has leverage in logistics, particularly in physical interventions like wiretapping, whatever. But in terms of encryption, you have anybody can have leverage. Okay, so I'm relating that to the issue of the confidence that the public has in businesses, in government. Does the internet add in a positive way and in a negative way to that level of confidence that we have in government, business, whatever? Does the internet has an effect, a strong effect, positively or negatively?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Let's take the last one. So it's yours.
It also somewhat relates to my previous speakers about inequality and how technology plays a role. We haven't really heard anything about gender much, and I know that the ambassador has also worked with the OECD Gender Initiative, and maybe you could elaborate a little bit on ICTs in a gendered space and like how maybe women actually seeing further growth of inequality. I mean, probably not in the northern hemisphere, but when we're looking at developing countries when it comes to access to technology, is this helping social norms, or is this actually reinforcing social norms that are on the ground already?
All very good questions. So let's use the answers for these questions to wrap up. So I'll start with Jeff, please.
Okay. Well, those are all great questions, and I guess maybe just a general observation is I think the internet can be both a powerful tool to help solve some of these concerns, but it also can maybe magnify the problem. So one example would be, think about how much information can shed light on what's happening, whether it's police violence or authoritarian regimes, hate to be in the limelight, and the internet can be a very powerful tool for exposing what's happening, but that can also easily be turned around into increasing either disparities or being misused as well. So I think it's up to all of us to try and, kind of focus on where can we use the internet to bridge the gaps that exist and to solve the problems, but we also have to be on guard against how it can be misused as well and end up making things worse.
Ambassador.
Uh-oh.
Do you want Peter to go first?
Yeah.
Okay, Peter, please.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I mean, one thing to think about is that the idea that the internet accelerates offline trends. The internet didn't create, gender disparities. It didn't create violence and conflict. Yeah, it's possible that it could accelerate those trends, especially when, it's not the open environment of where free expression is respected. But rather just another tool to broadcast, viewpoints. I think, I did talk about gendered attacks a little bit. So, I mean, I think it's important to note that, there's a legitimate fear that a lot of women and girls have of going online, but it also can be a liberating tool in an environment. And that's why I think it's so important to link, SDGs, 9 on infrastructure to SDGs on women, and and to talk to local communities and understand how the internet's being used, who has access to it, and why. Because you're absolutely right, there are patriarchal communities where even if you hand a cell phone to a woman, she goes home, she'll lose access to that device. And so I think, coming back to building respect for the internet and talking through why it causes so much fear in people is important.
Thank you, Peter.
Yes, those were such good questions that I'm going to be wrestling with them after I leave. I guess bottom line for me is I feel like the internet is the ability to break institutions, and a lot of those institutions embed our values, and they probably would have broken over time anyway, but it accelerates that, as Peter said, and we need to think about which of our values we want to embed in new institutions. I think that's incredibly important. One of the things the internet can do is empower the long tail, empower the smaller group that, let's say in a broadcast world where you only had 4 big stations, it was very white bread and designed for the middle of the market. Now that you have a multiplicity of offerings on the internet, very different small communities can be served. Think of Amazon and how small market books now have this big audience, or eBay as another example. And so it should be very empowering in both bad and good ways. It gives the bad actor an ability to amplify himself or herself, but it also should give an ability to reach smaller groups of interest. But sometimes that perfect market doesn't work. And so you would think that with all this data and the internet, some human biases, when you think of Moneyball, the idea of Moneyball is when you have all this data, you're going to make more rational decisions. But if you're designing a system with all your biases embedded somehow in it, then it can exacerbate those. So we just have to think about that a lot. And one of the things Nielsen does, I've been working at Nielsen for the last few years, is they put together data on consumption by various multicultural groups and gender to show that advertisers and content producers were missing market opportunities. They just had some preconceptions. And so it should be that if you had that information, that data, and the ability to reach people, that you would do a better job than before you had the internet and data. And I just think, we just have to work on making sure that we allow the benefits of the internet and data to really empower communities, empower women who especially are still being left out.
That is great. I think we're out of time. So I think it was a great conversation. Please help me to thank our panelists. Thank you. Thank you.